best way to tackle this budget crisis, Marylanders might be facing a harsh financial future.
Something that we think is a little bit tone deaf.
With proposals on the table to hike up taxes and fees and federal funding on the line, state leaders have some tough decisions to make.
Is everything included in that proposal something that you would be on board with?
I'm going in depth on the budget and what lawmakers need to do to cut down the deficit.
Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Fox 45 News In Depth. I'm Mikenzie Frost. Today, we're taking a closer look at the budget battle in Annapolis and how it's impacting Marylanders. The state is still staring down a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit, which is projected to double in size within the next 5 years. At Thursday's Board of Revenue Estimates meeting, officials painted a dire picture of what they're calling a worst-case scenario, with the state's projected revenue now $280 million less than expected.
Taking into account that revenue volatility cap, the reduction is $280 million over the 2-year period. Compared to what our expectations were in December, a worst-case scenario has developed. These cuts are materializing quicker than anticipated, and they're as bad or worse than what we feared in December.
That loss in revenue means state leaders have to find new ways to make up the deficit, which could end up shifting the burden onto taxpayers. On the table for lawmakers this session in Annapolis is a menu of options to close the $3 billion budget deficit. People from all sides of the political aisle, even nonpartisan groups, are serving up ideas. Most recently, Democrats are proposing a 2.5% business-to-business tax. Supporters say it could provide $1 billion in new revenue. The tax would apply to businesses providing another business service. Senate President Bill Ferguson says federal funding and job cuts could cost Maryland millions.
The last thing that we in the Senate want to do is consider revenues at all. But if it means eviscerating our social safety net, it has to be on the table.
But Republicans say a B2B tax should be taken off the menu permanently, especially as Governor Wes Moore tries to craft Maryland's image as more business friendly.
Something that we think is a little bit tone deaf when it comes to trying to say that you want to increase economic growth, but yet you're potentially taxing more businesses.
But that's not all. The budget options continue. The Department of Legislative Services, or DLS, is serving up several ideas too, like eliminating the tax-free back-to-school shopping week, increase state property tax by 1 cent per $100 of assessed value, going from 11.2 cents to 12.2, implementing a sales tax on salty snacks, and doubling the transfer tax on high-value properties. Is everything included in that proposal something that you would be on board with? What should Marylanders expect to see when this negotiation completes?
I'm going to work with anybody and everybody, and I will look at any and all options to make sure that we can grow this economy and that we can make Maryland more business friendly, that we can give middle-class Marylanders a tax cut, because middle-class Marylanders need some tax relief.
Not a direct answer from the governor about the specific options outlined by DLS. And when pressed again,
I have 3 North Stars: making sure we're giving middle-class Marylanders a tax cut, making sure that we're making it easier for businesses to be able to grow and thrive in our state, and making sure that we can invest in our people. I will work with the General Assembly on which proposals make sense and which I think do not make sense, but those are my 3 goals.
what doesn't make sense? The governor directed to other questions instead. The governor has his own ideas too. Governor Moore's budget plan includes raising taxes on wealthy Marylanders, investing in new industries like quantum, AI, and life sciences, and carving out $2 billion in other savings through cuts to programs and spending.
I ask the members of this committee, let's work together to give the middle class a break, because they need it.
But the tax breaks the governor says would hit 2/3 of Marylanders would save the average person $173. The Board of Revenue Estimates says 1 in 5 Marylanders would see an increase in their tax burden by nearly $1,500. The governor's plan also calls for $1 billion in new tax revenue, including a 75-cent delivery fee for the Transportation Trust Fund, raising questions from some GOP senators.
I'm a fan of mass transit. I'm one of few on our party that actually support mass transit and want to see that thrive throughout our state. But the reality is most people in Maryland don't use it.
But the governor's tax plan is facing pushback because in it, he wants to eliminate the itemized tax deduction and double the standard deduction. Some analysts argue it would not save Marylanders money. Monday, the governor also releasing a supplemental budget calling to restore $300 million in funding. The governor providing $37 million to the Department of Labor's delayed paid family and medical leave system. $9 million for an anticipated surge in unemployment insurance claims from laid-off federal workers amid President Donald Trump's move to shrink the government. He's also cutting $80 million from his strategic energy investment fund. Right now, it's not clear what plans will make the cut, but as lawmakers review the menu of options to close the budget deficit, a special session later in the year to make even more adjustments becomes a bigger possibility.
That laundry list of new taxes and fees has some Marylanders feeling like the state is nickel and diming them. Some people say they understand why lawmakers need to find new forms of revenue, but the majority told us they're not happy about the possibility of having to pay more.
I feel pretty angry if I had to pay any more taxes and fees because the cost of living in Maryland is already high.
People don't need more stress. People don't need more things to pay for.
That would be like $3 or $4-ish a week. And then over a year, it's $150. Maybe it wouldn't matter.
I do think that times are tough right now for everybody, and every little bit can really hurt.
It's unnecessary. I feel like everyone's already in a place where it's already hard to live. I guess I'll always figure it out, but you know, there are other people that may not have the means or the ability to figure it out.
The latest UMBC polls show taxes and fees are a high priority for the majority of Marylanders. Raising taxes on the wealthy and lowering them for most families was a key part of Governor Moore's 2025 budget proposal. On Wednesday, the governor said he won't sign any budget proposal unless it supports Maryland families.
We had to be able to give middle-class families a bit of relief. And we had to be able to make sure that they were supported and we weren't going to build the economy on their backs. Whatever proposals come out of this, if it meets those criteria, that's a proposal that I will work with and I'm good with. But if it does not, that's not a proposal that I am good with.
Even as the governor promises to help working families, UMBC reports more than half of those polled say they have considered moving out of Maryland within the next few years. I spoke with the Maryland Family Institute president Jeff Trimbath, who says residents may have to weigh the pros and cons of moving to a different state for a better economic opportunity, or else make tough decisions about their financial futures.
We've seen a huge migration from high tax states, primarily in the Northeast, to Florida and North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee. All these things have been well documented. And so Maryland families would have to decide how much am I committed to staying here versus how much am I committed to pursuing more economically prosperous opportunities elsewhere. Am I willing to give up this college that my kid has just gotten into that I really love and my kid really loves, but I just can't afford it because Annapolis is asking me to pay more taxes? Those are the kinds of very real decisions that Maryland families are facing as Annapolis elites fail to get our fiscal house in order.
Republicans say the governor should be looking at other ways to balance the budget, including a hiring freeze. Several offices and departments are looking to add to their staffs, including the governor's office, which is calling for 3 new staff members. The comptroller's office wants to add 117 new positions. The proposed budget for the Department of Labor calls for 125 new staff members, and the Department of Environment wants to add 52 positions. Statewide agencies are looking to add 900 new employees overall, while the governor says the hiring is necessary for state government to run efficiently and effectively. Senator J.B. Jennings is calling it unsustainable.
We just want to make sure that we are putting together the most effective government possible.
He's going to have to cut somewhere. What's he going to do when he doesn't have money in the fall? Are you going to do furloughs? Are you going to have layoffs?
Joining me now are 2 members of the Maryland Freedom Caucus, Delegate Kathy Shalega and Delegate Brian Chisholm. Thank you both for being here. First, I want to ask you, what was your reaction when you first heard the new revenue estimates projected $280 million in less revenue over the next 2 years?
Well, I wasn't surprised. We had heard it was coming, and it's, frankly, Mikenzie, it's laughable that they're blaming this on Donald Trump. A large part of this write-down came from numbers that were in place before Donald Trump got elected. So they were slower revenues that came in last year. So, you know, this is not a Donald Trump problem, but they are going to try to make it that. And they've been warned. I mean, experts have been telling lawmakers and the governor in Annapolis that the economy is struggling and you better stop the spending spree.
Does it concern you at all about the federal workers who are expected to be laid off? They're projecting some 28,000 federal workers in the state of Maryland alone to be out of a job. Does that concern you about the state's bottom line?
Yeah, it's always concerning. Of course, we don't want good people losing their job, but at this point, we can't continue to run up this deficit. I mean, when we're talking about the federal government, we're talking about $37 trillion. Everybody understands that that's unsustainable. I think that good, hardworking people are going to land on their feet. The problem is, the only way we're ever going to get out of this budget problem is to grow the private sector and cut government spending. And the problem is, right now, we're looking at Governor Moore, and his solution to this is to grow government. You see this. He wants to add 5,000 new employees, and he's continuing to cut the private sector. That's why we're the fourth highest migrated state out in the country.
So there are obviously a lot of plans on the table when it comes to generating new revenue. Is there anything that either of you would support in terms of bringing in more money to the state, or are you looking for no new tax hikes or tax fee increases in the state?
Well, we are committed. The Freedom Caucus, Delegate Chisholm and I, the rest of the members, we are committed to no new taxes. Look, 20 years ago, the government took from every citizen, just the state of Maryland, about $4,000 a year per person. Today, the state of Maryland is taking almost $11,000 per person out of your checkbook. And so we just need to freeze this. We don't need more tax increases. What we need is fiscal responsibility. We have a budget that has been growing at 6% at least, with an economy that's growing about 3%. It's just frankly not sustainable. And, you know, I hope that the lawmakers in Annapolis will see that. I am truly concerned about the tax increases that they're going to pass.
What would you cut in the budget if you don't want to see any tax increases?
I think if you just freeze the budget where it is right now and try to grow the private sector. Right now, we're continuing to grow. The governor's own executive office is proposing to go from $16 million right now for his salaries in his office to $24 million in his office. I suspect that's because he's running for governor and doesn't really care about running the state of Maryland. And that's sad, because the only way to get out of this is really to grow the private sector. Stop spending where we are right now. We don't need drastic cuts, but stop the spending and grow the private sector. We're 50 out of 50 states in labor costs. We're 44th in business friendliness. You cannot get out of this budget problem without growing the private sector. He says that, but does the opposite.
How do you think the B2B, the business-to-business tax, would impact that?
This business-to-business tax is potentially, look, this is my 15th year in Annapolis, and this might be the worst idea I've seen yet. We are calling on Governor Wes Moore to come out and say he's going to veto this. He just said that he will not sign something that hurts middle-class people. This business-to-business tax will harm small businesses, middle-class families. So landscaping businesses that cut the grass of another business will have to charge them a tax. Your accountant will have to charge a small business a tax. You know, it is taxing small business. And small business is the heart of Maryland's economy. You just can't balance the budget on the backs of small business, which are our families and our middle class people that live here.
The B2B tax, the delivery tax, the governor says he doesn't expect those taxes to be passed on to the consumer. Is that unrealistic?
I think there's going to be a battle now between the Democrat lawmakers and the governor. I mean, today there was another bill heard on sugary drinks. So now we're going after chips, sugary drinks, deliveries to your front door. Everything that moves, they want to tax. And who wins? I don't know. It seems like the General Assembly seems to be able to flex their muscle more than the governor at times. And if that's the case, they're worse than the governor at this point of what they want to spend and what they want to tax. So I don't know where we're going to come out, but there's no good options at this point.
All right, delegates, thank you for joining us. I appreciate your time. We have a lot more to get through as the session wraps up, so this conversation is far from over.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mikenzie.
Now, we reached out to Democratic budget leaders to participate in this conversation. They had scheduling conflicts. They did answer questions about the budget, though, saying protecting services against cuts from the Trump administration will be top of mind as they continue to work to balance the budget.
It's going to be incumbent on the two budget chairs as well as the presiding officers in the entire chamber to get together in the coming days to figure out how we can absorb these really draconian cuts. We will do everything in our power to avoid the most difficult cuts to people who need it, because Marylanders are counting on us. There will probably have to continue to be cuts that we look at as we move forward, and revenue to make sure we can protect things like education, DDA.
This week, we asked what your message to lawmakers is as they consider new taxes and fees. We'll take a look at your responses coming up a little later in the show. Still to come, the Trump administration has already frozen some of Maryland's federal funding, and more could be at risk. We'll take a closer look at how new proposals could lead the federal government to withhold even more funding. The Trump administration is withholding $330 million in federal grant awards for about 30 State Department transportation projects. That includes Governor Wes Moore's program to promote the use of electric vehicles. The funding freeze comes as critics argue Maryland leaders are taking action that could mean more federal dollars are withheld as the Trump administration promises to cut funding to jurisdictions that disobey his orders. That includes a proposed bill that would keep ICE agents out of protected spaces like churches and schools. That's in direct opposition of an executive order allowing agents to operate in and around those areas. Mayor Brandon Scott released a statement pushing back on the president's executive orders cutting back on DEI initiatives, saying the city will fight with, quote, every legal tool available.
The thing that the mayor needs to be more careful of is who the president is. When you're in the lesser situation, the weaker situation, a mayor compared to a president that has vast more resources than you have. I think you have to be careful not to poke the bear.
Federal funding will be particularly critical to Baltimore and other parts of the state as the American Rescue Plan dollars run out. Baltimore City has relied on ARPA funds to fund city programs, including the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, which received $45 million of those dollars. Councilman Isaac Yitzi Schleifer told FOX45 News the council is looking into how funding for those programs may be shifted.
We know that the ARPA dollars are running out, and so obviously there's going to have to be some type of shift because the money is not going to continue to flow in the way that it has in the past. So certainly some of that strategy is going to change.
Joining us now is Rachel Gressler, a senior research fellow from the Heritage Foundation. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So there's a lot of concern right now from local lawmakers about the impact of federal cuts on the state budget as the budgeting process plays out. Do you believe that that reflects an over-reliance on federal funding to balance Maryland's state budget?
Absolutely. We've seen a significant increase over recent years in the percentage of Maryland's funding that is coming from the federal government. It's now over 30%. That's a drastic change since even 5 years ago. And I think looking at Maryland's budget, it is very troubling. The state's own recognition in its fiscal sustainability study said that Maryland is in worse shape now than it was during the Great Recession. We're on track for a 16% deficit, and that is not because we aren't collecting enough in taxes. You know, Maryland has one of the wealthiest tax bases in the nation, highest median income. The problem is spending. Spending has increased 50% since prior to the pandemic, and yet we don't have much to show for that. It's not because the population has grown. We're just seeing declines in terms of things like what they are spending on and not having the outcomes that we should be seeing from those.
And when it comes to the impact of federal workforce on the state of Maryland as more people lose their jobs as the federal government goes in a different direction and shrinks, what would that mean for the state's bottom line?
Maryland will see a disproportionate impact, but the federal workforce is actually very spread across the entire United States. So it will be a little more for sure in Maryland. But I think where we're really going to see the biggest impact is talking about the schools and the welfare programs. In the schools, we heard President Trump say in his address to Congress the other night that schools that are allowing boys to play on girls' teams will no longer be receiving federal funding. And we know that they're going to crack down on waste, fraud, and abuse. And there's a lot of that that's happening in the welfare programs. It's not talking about cuts to Medicaid. It's talking about the fact that an analysis I put out estimates $1.1 trillion in improper payments in Medicaid over the last 10 years. And so if states aren't even bothering to check if people that they're enrolling in Medicaid are eligible, then they're probably going to lose some funding for that.
And looking at other areas in which local jurisdictions could lose funding, immigration is a big conversation here in the state as well as on the national stage. Do you believe that jurisdictions that still have policies in place that prevent them or prohibit them from working with ICE or other immigration efforts, does that put federal funding at risk for them as well?
I think it will, and it will particularly come down to when they are using federal funds to provide benefits to people who are here illegally.
Are there any other policies that you could see in terms of this conversation about federal funding that would impact Maryland overall or other local jurisdictions if they keep them in place?
I think it's just a bigger picture. We're seeing that the federal government is recognizing that there's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse, and there's also some areas where the federal government should just not be the one funding particular things. And when we look at the size of the federal government and its own debt that's equal to about $275,000 for every household in America, the federal government is not in a position that it can continue to be funding, in Maryland, almost a third of the state budget. And so I think that Maryland in particular, but all states need to be considering how they can fund more of their own budgets going forward.
And as these lawmakers here in the state continue to look at the budget and look at areas to cut, what's your message to them if they are looking at a fiscal future from the federal government that has less funding coming to the state? How do they balance the budget and make sure that taxes are not part of that conversation?
Yep, and that's looking at the spending. So Maryland in particular, we've seen, for example, a 30% increase in public employee compensation over just the last 5 years. We've seen a massive expansion in welfare benefits, even though Maryland is a disproportionately wealthy state. And I would look to the schools. Maryland spends 60% more per pupil than Florida, and yet we have worse outcomes, especially when it comes to reducing disparities in education. And I think that's a lot of administrative bloat in the schools that's not getting down to the classroom. And it's sad for me as a parent to see, at the end of the last year when they said, oh, the budgets are affecting the schools, and they weren't providing the kids with paper. And so I think you need to cut the administrative bloat before you tell kids they can't have paper.
All right. Rachel Grisler from the Heritage Foundation, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
This week, we asked you what you want state lawmakers to know as they consider new taxes and fees. We'll take a look at your responses after the break.
Here's tonight's primetime lineup on Fox 45. Brought to you locally by your McDonald's owner-operators.
This week, we asked you what your message is to state lawmakers as they consider new taxes and fees, and almost everyone had some of the same responses. Stop spending, stop hiring people, and making Marylanders hurt even more, said Nora. And Lisa said, don't, we had a surplus. Tasha says, stop spending. Roy says, stop spending, we're being taxed to death. Ruth, are you trying to crush what's left of your Maryland middle class? That's it for this week's edition of Fox 45 News In Depth. I'm Mikenzie Frost.